Welcome, everybody, to our live webinar, 9/11, An Architect's Guide, a three-part series. Today is Thursday, July 15th, 2021. I'm Richard Gage, AIA, member of the American Institute of Architects and founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization representing a growing body of now more than 3,400 architects and engineers signed on to the petition demanding a new investigation into the destruction of all three World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. Last week, we presented part 2 in this series, the Twin Towers' explosive destruction. This is part 3, the Twin Towers in extreme heat, in which we'll be looking into the evidence of very high temperature incendiaries and chemical reactions involved in the destruction of these two skyscrapers. But first, let me introduce you to our operations manager and the host of 9/11 Freefall, Mr. Andy Steele. Hey, Andy.
Hello, Richard. Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in today. I just want to let everyone know that I'm here to help with any technical glitches, which will occur from time to time. Also, we'll be happy to take your questions at the end of the webinar today. Best way to submit them is in the questions and information form, which is online at ae911truth.org. Just go to continuing education and select the live webinars. It's the best way to submit them, but I'll also be looking at the YouTube and Facebook broadcast as well in the comments in the chat box, just see if there's any good comments or questions related to the material that Richard will be presenting today. So with all of that said, back to you, Richard.
And thanks so much, Andy. Just so people know something about my background, I was responsible at a local firm here in the San Francisco Bay Area for these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums. And more recently, where'd it go? Over here. There we go. $125 million high school, which I did the construction administration for. And I had similar responsibilities working more recently on this $400 million mixed-use project near Las Vegas with 6 blocks of retail, mid-rise office space, and parking structure, altogether about 1,200 tons of fireproof steel framing. I now spend most of my time, though, working, educating architects, engineers, and others to understand what happened at the World Trade Center using the material in these courses. So with that said, let's get into it, because the scientific method is something that we reviewed last week and I want to look at it again. It's extremely important. That's how we operate here at AE 9/11 Truth. We follow the science. Formulate a question. How do the towers collapse? We do some background research, make some observations. How have other towers collapsed? We construct a hypothesis. That's our best guess as to how the towers might have collapsed. We lay out all the rational hypotheses. Maybe the planes had something to do with it. Maybe the fires. And of course, we had both of those. And maybe it was explosions, for which we looked at a whole lot of evidence last week in part 2 of this series. If you missed it, please search on YouTube for it. It's free, and you need that basic set of information, so we can add on to it today with the explanation of extreme heat. Maybe it was controlled demolition. We have a lot of evidence that we've been building for that hypothesis, but we lay out all the hypotheses. We don't focus in on one or another due to our personal, financial, or political obligations that might sway our objective opinion in a matter as to what might be the cause of the building's collapse. So we make predictions based on those hypotheses. We test those predictions with experiments. We analyze the results. We draw conclusions. If the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner, so all can build on the body of the work that we're doing. If the hypothesis is not corroborated, as we'll find out that the official story, the hypothesis is not supported, we do what? We go back and we construct a new hypothesis. And that's what we're about today. And until we find a hypothesis that is corroborated by the experiments, the research, the conclusions based on the analysis. So with that in mind, let's do some research and find out what are the forces that destroy buildings. Well, fire is certainly one of them. It's an organic, chaotic process. Burns out the area in roughly 20 minutes or so, moving on, looking for fresh new fuel sources. So when we have when we have a fire, we find that even NIST acknowledges that these fires don't persist in any one location for more than about 20 or 30 minutes. That's all the fuel there is in our modern office buildings, for instance. But say in a wood frame building, we haven't lost a skyscraper, as you'll see. But in a wood frame building where the structure itself is combustible, the building, it falls over to the path of least resistance. It doesn't fall straight down through the path of what should have been the greatest resistance. It would follow the laws of entropy, increasing chaos, disintegration. So there was a study in 1995, the largest one. They built an 8-story building with the intent to bring it down by fire. So they put incredible fuel loads, as you can see here, in all throughout the building, and tried to get those temperatures up as high as they possibly could. And they found that even with, well, we'll see what they found. But look, they have beams, columns that are fireproof, other columns that are not. These beams, in this case, not fireproofed. So let's see what happens in this test.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted, even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In over 20 years, I have not seen, until recently, a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
Until recently, of course, he's referring to 9/11, when we had not 2, but 3 protected steel structures collapse due to fire. If you missed the third skyscraper, we looked at that the first Thursday in July this month, and you can search on YouTube for that one as well. That's part 1 of this 3-part series, 9/11, an Architect's Guide, a 3-part series. So what happens in steel buildings? They don't fail. The connections don't fail. And of course, the connections are what NIST focused on as the collapse initiation hypothesis and failure in that building, which was fireproofed. And we don't even have fireproofing on these connections, and yet there's no failure whatsoever. The beam will warp, as you see. But NIST, by the way, is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who was tasked by Congress to explain these collapses to the American people. They've already started off on the wrong foot, and as you'll see, we've uncovered dozens and dozens of fraudulent science on the part of their NIST and their final report. The executive summary cites that it's an inherently stable behavior in steel frame due to the highly redundant nature of the form. So this is incredibly important information to have in our backpack, as is the nature of collapses that are natural collapses. In this case, concrete buildings and earthquakes causing these buildings to fall over. They don't break up into the column. They aren't severed, and their columns and beams are not severed one from another. The concrete is not pulverized to a fine powder, as you'll see in the case of the Twin Towers. We recognize a building as such at the base. These buildings were blown up. We have thick, billowing, enormous pyroclastic-like clouds that are expanding rapidly in cauliflower-shaped forms due to the incredible heat from the hot gases that are ignited during the chemical reaction. We have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions. They see flashes of light. If we have these features, we know darn sure that we have explosions. Now, as you saw last week, and as you'll see this week, explosions are not a part of the official story whatsoever, other than the initial explosion of the plane impacts. So we have a real problem when we have all of these witnesses we looked at last week of explosions. Now, explosives can be harnessed quite effectively to bring down tall buildings. Let's look at this controlled demolition series here. You've all seen the old hotels in Las Vegas, for instance, and that's similar to, well, the same as what we're looking at here. It takes hundreds and hundreds of shaped cutter charges placed at specific columns and beams in the building, and then they are detonated in a very precise order in order to bring buildings down like this. It's quite a science. And fire doesn't do this, interestingly, to buildings. So we're going to compare what fire can do to buildings today versus what explosives or incendiaries, particularly today, can do to buildings. There's only a handful of companies in the United States that can even accomplish this. And again, fire has not. So there's a set of typical features associated with controlled demolition. One, there's a sudden onset of destruction, usually at the base of the structure, but not always, as you'll see today. There's a straight down symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint. And that is achieved by a patterned removal of column supports. So there's a free fall acceleration straight down through the path of what should have been the greatest resistance, the thousands of tons of structure in the building, and resulting in the total dismemberment of the structural steel frame, broken up, ready for loading and shipment. We have limited damage to adjacent structures, and that's one of the goals of controlled demolition. We have patterned explosions heard and seen by witnesses, flashes of light seen by witnesses. We have broken up concrete floors. That's one of the things you need to do in order to not have to send people in later with jackhammers. So you want to break up those floors into removable sections. And so there are explosive charges visible at many of the floors, as you saw last week in part 2. And there's chemical evidence of explosive devices, as we're going to be looking at very carefully today in part 3. These are just direct evidence of destruction with explosives, all these 10 features. Fire doesn't create these features, any of them, let alone all of them. So if we have all 10 features, we can be darn sure that we have a controlled demolition. Fire causes structures to collapse asymmetrically with gradual deformations, following the path of least resistance, i.e., the building will fall over. We have many examples of high-rises on fire, dozens and dozens. And we haven't lost one of these steel framed fireproofed skyscrapers.
May 4th, 1988, the First Interstate Bank, a 62-story building in Los Angeles, California, suffered a 3.5-hour fire which burned across 5 floors and caused an estimated $200 million of damage. It did not collapse. February 23rd, 1991, the One Meridian Plaza, a 38-story building in Philadelphia, suffered an 18-hour fire which burned across 8 floors. The fire caused an estimated $100 million worth of damage and 3 firefighters died fighting it. It was later described by officials as the most significant fire of the century. It did not collapse. October 17, 2004, the East Tower of the Park Central complex in Caracas, Venezuela, suffered a 17-hour fire which spread across 26 of its 56 floors. It did not collapse. August 18, 2007, a fire broke out on the 17th floor of the Deutsche Bank building in New York, a building undergoing deconstruction after being heavily damaged by debris from the South Tower on 9/11. Originally 41 stories in height, it had been reduced to 26 at the time of the fire, which lasted 7 hours and affected a total of 10 floors. 2 firefighters died of smoke inhalation. It did not collapse. On 9/11 itself, 5 World Trade Center, a 9-story building east of the North Tower, was engulfed in flames after sustaining heavy damage from falling debris. A number of partial collapses occurred, but the overall structure remained standing. February 9, 2009, the Mandarin Oriental Hotel in Beijing was completely engulfed in flames for more than 3 hours during the Lunar New Year celebrations. The fire affected all 44 floors, igniting fireworks as it burned. 1 firefighter died fighting it. It did not collapse.
No, and neither did this one. World Trade Center 5, as you mentioned, surely engulfed completely in fire. But it doesn't collapse. The mid-rise and high-rise fireproof steel frame skyscrapers and mid-rises do not collapse, not even after 9/11 in these very, very fully engulfed building fires. We haven't lost one of them. And yet these fires are said to have brought this building, World Trade Center 1 and 2, both of them, down but the fires are diminished at the time of the collapse. The thick black smoke indicates oxygen-starved and cooler fires. Why haven't we lost a high-rise? Well, one reason is the steel conducts the heat away. Even in the test that you saw earlier, there's, without fireproofing, which is an insulation, the steel doesn't fail. It conducts that heat away. It's very efficient. And so the steel never gets to its 1200 degree Fahrenheit temperature, at which point steel can lose half of its strength and begin to sag. Also, just to keep that from ever becoming a problem, we put cementitious fireproofing on, which keeps the beam safe for 2 hours in a raging fire, which doesn't even happen, as we've already noted. 20 minutes, 30 minutes is the time that we have. So these is the maximum time the fire has fuel to burn. So we have 2-hour protection on the beams and 3-hour protection on the columns. That's 4 to 6 times as much protection as we will ever need to keep these beams safe, which is why we've never lost a steel frame fireproof skyscraper due to fire. And we also keep the tenants from bringing in large fuel contents. We keep the contractors from building these buildings out of flammable materials like wood, for instance. So we have we sprinkler these buildings in modern times also to keep any fire from ever becoming a problem. So the sprinklers were said to have been compromised in the case of the Twin Towers by the impact of the airplanes. With additional circumstantial corroborative evidence that can help us understand that that a building has been blown up in a controlled demolition With government documentation, you don't just bring these buildings down in an afternoon. You need approvals, and so this takes months to achieve. And there's foreknowledge of the building's destruction, as we saw in the case of Building 7. Plenty of foreknowledge of the destruction of that building in part 1 of this series. So, and experts agree, at least those experts without financial or political obligations that might sway their objective opinion in the matter of whether a building's been brought down by controlled demolition or not, along with video documentation, which we'll be looking at plenty of today also. This is proof, or can be, of controlled demolition. With that in mind, let's go to the World Trade Center towers and apply that proof against this model. Starting with, is there a sudden onset of destruction at the location of the plane impacts? Well, and we did that last week in part 2 of this series. We saw also patterned explosions and flashes of light heard and seen by witnesses. We saw a straight down symmetrical progression, but outside the footprint in this very explosive demolition. We saw ejections of building materials at the lower floors. And we saw 20, 40, 60 stories down below what we're told is a collapsing building. So that made no sense. Neither does the acceleration, the free fall acceleration, straight down through what should have been the path of greatest resistance, resulting in the total shattering of the structural steel frame from top to bottom. The lateral ejection of structural steel 600 feet in all directions at even 80 miles an hour laterally. 4 and 8 ton structural steel sections shot out laterally. The gravity works down. We saw evidence of 90,000 tons of pulverized concrete in each of the towers. We saw direct evidence of destruction with explosives. And that's what all of that amounts to. It's not that fire can create any of these, let alone all of them. So that was very damning evidence last week that we showed regarding the official story. So this week we're going to be looking at pyroclastic-like clouds of pulverized concrete, but incredible heat. And so let's start with it. The National Fire Protection Association Guide 921 is the guide for investigation of fire and explosions. And they say, look for thermal effects. And that's the large volume of gas and the large amount of heat released in chemical explosions, causing rapidly expanding plumes of hot gases, as we see racing away from the Twin Towers in all of these photographs and videos, expanding 10 times the volume of the building in just 30 seconds. This is an incredible amount of energy, not produced by those few small fires that you saw at the time of the collapse, which flames were surely extinguished as the mechanical action of the collapse ensued. So, yes, we have no explanation for the incredible heat producing these, especially explanation from these few small fires, again, which were surely put out by the collapse itself. No, we're looking for something on the order of this, an incredible quantity of heat. So where do we go to find it? Well, let's start with Massimo Mazzucco's 9/11 New Pearl Harbor, a great video which documents the incredible heat found in the basements of the World Trade Center.
Possibly the most important unexplained phenomenon at Ground Zero are the extremely high temperatures registered under the rubble for many weeks after the collapses. On September 16, NASA shot these thermographic images of Ground Zero, indicating unusually high temperatures at the base of the 3 collapsed buildings. Despite the heavy rains of September 14th, the hotspots registered peak temperatures of more than 1,300 degrees under the rubble. 10 days later, the fires kept burning.
What's to explain, Governor, the smoke that still comes out of the fire?
There's still fire down below. There is such an incredibly deep pile of rubble, and the tower goes down 5-6 stories underground.
But we had ABC crews come back just in the last few minutes and telling us there are still flames coming out of the base of the trade towers.
For the rescue workers, this became an additional burden on their already gruesome task.
Out still on the rubble, it's still, I believe, 1,100 degrees. The guy's boots just melt within a few hours.
On October 8th, the hotspots under the 3 collapsed buildings remained clearly visible. 6 weeks later, as the excavations progressed, the situation seemed only to get worse.
Oh, it's unbelievable. And this is 6 weeks later, almost 6 weeks later. And as we get closer to the center of this, it gets hotter and hotter. It's probably 1,500 degrees. We've had some small windows into what we thought was a board at some point, and it looked like an oven. You know, it was just roaring inside. It was just a bright reddish orange color.
The consequences of such extreme temperatures were quite visible on the steel that was being extracted from the rubble.
The grapplers were pulling stuff out, big sections of iron that were literally on fire on the other end. They would hit the air and burst into flames, which was pretty spooky to see.
You would create an air pocket by moving steel, fueling the fire underground. But, you know, these underground fires were just like the fires of hell.
If you could make a video of what you perceive hell to look like, from fire shooting up at times, that's what would happen. You would be in the middle of what would look like steel, and then fire just would pop up. Firemen were coming out with, and ironworkers with their boots literally melted. And then the hose would come over and they would try to put that part out.
I got there.
Charlie Vichers was a supervisor of removal operations at Ground Zero. From PBS's America Rebuilds page, we read, Vichers' crew picked up 40 to 60 foot long pieces of steel impaled in the pile, where the bottom 20 feet would be glowing red hot. Vichers said, trucks loaded with steel would pass by and you could feel the back of your neck burning standing 20 feet away. In an article called A Dangerous Work Site, the U.S. Department of Labor wrote, underground fires burned at temperatures of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. This was confirmed by Mayor Giuliani.
There were fires of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit below the ground.
The Journal of the American Society of Safety Engineers wrote, thermal measurements taken by helicopter each day showed underground temperatures ranging from 400 to more than 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. 8 weeks later, and the fires still had not subsided.
You see how this debris is still smoking? That's from the fires that are still burning. 8 weeks later, we still got fires burning. So, I mean, these things are burning. At one point, I think they were about 2,800 degrees.
11 weeks later, and the fires kept burning.
As recently as the end of November, it was still 1,100 degrees down underneath the rubble.
As November turned into December, ice was noticed in the mornings above the ground, but the debris underneath was still smoldering.
The weird thing was it was very cold when we were up there. I believe it was in the middle of the winter, but the ground wasn't frozen. The ground kind of like bubbled underneath your feet, which was kind of strange to me.
It took until December 19, more than 3 months after the collapses, for the last underground fire to be extinguished.
Yes, it did. It took a long, long time. And look what the structural engineers and others are saying during that time. Red hot steel being pulled from deep within the pile, dripping from the molten steel, says this firefighter. Saw pools of literally molten steel at the World Trade Center, says the president of Tully Construction, the lead cleanup company. Seeing the molten steel, uncovering red-hot metal beams, ranging from molten metal, which was still red-hot weeks after the molten steel at the heart of the tower's remains, streams of molten metal that leaked and flowed down from the hot cores, metal dripping from a beam, molten steel beams. The end of the beam would be dripping molten steel. Mark Loiseau, president of the cleanup company, one of them, Controlled Demolition, Inc., actually, interestingly. Molten steel was encountered primarily during the excavation of debris. There are photos and videos of the molten steel being dipped out by the buckets of the excavators, as you see here in this material held in the hands of this crab claw excavator, a dripping yellow and white hot liquid molten metal. And interestingly, a little river of steel flowing, says who? The World Trade Center structural engineer himself, Leslie Robertson. These are not conspiracy theorists we're listening to here. And this material that they're referring to cannot possibly be explained by the official story of jet fuel and fires, as we'll see. His associate, Richard Garlock, also saying the debris past the columns was red hot, molten, running. It doesn't happen in office fires. There's even liquid molten steel or iron pouring out of the South Tower minutes prior to its collapse. NIST says, well, this must be melted airplane. Well, molten aluminum appears silvery in daylight conditions like this, not white and yellow, white hot and yellow color. I didn't even know concrete could melt, but here in the police museum, concrete is melting above 3,200 degrees. I was unaware of that. Fire temperatures were so intense that concrete melted like lava around everything in its path, including this handgun wrapped in molten concrete. The FEMA author report says steel members in the debris pile that appear to have been partly evaporated in extraordinarily high temperatures, documented by the New York Times. There's a problem here, though. It takes 4,000 degrees to evaporate steel. And by the way, it takes 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit to melt steel. And yet, Abolhassan Astani, structural engineer supporting the official story, received a National Science Foundation grant. He says he saw melting of girders at the World Trade Center. If you remember the Salvador Dali paintings with clocks that are kind of melted, it's kind of like that. It can only happen if you get steel yellow hot or white hot, perhaps around 2,000. It's more like 2,800 degrees. Well, let's go back to Massimo Mazzucco and see what other evidence there is of these extreme temperatures.
Another proof of extremely high temperatures reached during the collapse are the twisted and mangled steel beams found at ground zero.
Architects, engineers, people who work with steel, welders have just never seen the level of destruction and the level of deformation of this material in our lives.
You saw steel, some of the thickest steel I've ever seen, bent like a pretzel.
This 8-ton steel I-beam is 6 inches thick. It was selected to be preserved for future generations for the near-perfect horseshoe-like bend formed during the collapse.
I found it hard to believe that it actually bent because of the size of it and how there's no cracks in the iron. It bent without almost a single crack in it. It takes thousands of degrees to bend steel like this.
In fact, the temperature of 2,800 degrees mentioned before is not casual at all, as that's exactly the temperature at which steel melts.
And this was documented by FEMA in their report, which is the 2002 Building Performance Assessment Team report, which came out in May of that year. And they had a metallurgical examination of the steel in an Appendix C. What did they document? A 1-inch column reduced to 1/2-inch thickness, its edges curled like a paper scroll, thinned to almost razor sharpness. So how do we get that? Rapid oxidation, sulfidation, intergranular melting. Liquid iron, that's molten iron, invading the grain boundaries of the steel. It's a hot sulfur formed during this hot corrosion attack on the steel. Where does the sulfur come from? Where does the iron come from? We haven't used iron in our skyscrapers for 100 years or so. We use steel alloys since then. They say no clear explanation for the source of the sulfur has been identified. They document it. They can't say where it came from. Perhaps the deepest mystery uncovered in the investigation. This is documented by the New York Times, and yet it's completely ignored by NIST. They take it out of the report altogether when they took over the investigation in 2004 or 2002. The presence of sulfur is very clearly documented. So they say sulfur is present in the gypsum wallboard that was prevalent in the interior partitions. But gypsum wallboard contains inert calcium sulfate. It's bonded. It can't come out and release sulfur. Besides, in its 100-year history of protecting steel, we have never had gypsum board turn around and attack the steel that it's designed to protect. No, doesn't happen. And besides, experiment is the arbiter of competing hypotheses. So we can put gypsum board crushed up inside a steel beam and get extremely hot fires, as you saw, and find that there's no attack on the steel. So NIST is simply making this up. Well, the smell of sulfur permeated the World Trade Center. Where was it coming from? It burned, the smell of sulfur. Can never block it out. It haunts me, says this iron worker or demolition worker at Ground Zero. And what does NIST have to say about all this phenomenon?
First of all, let's go back to your basic premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know of absolutely nobody, and no eyewitness who said so, nobody who's produced it.
But witnesses testify otherwise.
You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails. Like you're in a foundry. Like lava.
Actually melted beams where it was molten steel that was being dug out.
Underground, it was still so hot that molten metal dripped down the sides of a wall.
And the cleanup was very difficult in the beginning. Steel was coming out red in certain areas from the first couple of weeks.
This fused element of steel, molten steel. They pulled out the big block of concrete, and there was like a little river of steel flowing.
Okay, so what's the problem here? Here's John Gross, the co-project leader, whom you just heard, denying the evidence, actually handpicking a piece of evaporated steel from the pile. The very piece that was given to FEMA to study in that Appendix C of the, and this one referring to the Building 7 piece. They deny it, but their shadow is all over the evidence. Well, what can explain all of this? I mean, hydrocarbons, which is building materials and even jet fuel, it's just a hydrocarbon. They only burn 600 to maybe 1400 degrees at best. And that's confirmed by the main manufacturer of jet fuel, ME Petroleum, which says it burns 600 degrees maximum in open air. So what's going on here? Steel had definitely melted. Some estimates of the temperatures of the official story at the World Trade Center is 1200 degrees Fahrenheit. But we have temperatures exceeding 2700 degrees Fahrenheit, where steel melts or begins to melt. And what can produce that? Can thermite produce that? We'll look at that in a moment. But look, the evidence is very clear. Liquid molten metal falling out of the material held in the claws of this excavator. We can tell by the color of molten steel and iron what its temperature is. We're exceeding 2,500 degrees here. That's just the physics of molten metals like that. So what caused it to melt? Well, NIST has an answer to a very frequently asked question that they published on their website more than 10 years later. Any molten steel in the wreckage was more likely due to the high temperature resulting from long exposure to combustion within the pile, rather than to short exposure to fires or explosions while the buildings were standing. Oh yeah, there's a problem here. It's called the conservation of energy. It's a law. In a closed system, such as fires burning under the pulverized concrete powder in the basements of the World Trade Center, the amount of energy is fixed. You can't create more energy inside the system. The fire can't get somehow hotter and hotter and hotter than the capacity of the fuel that it's burning. It just doesn't work like that. You can only convert energy you have from one form to another. In other words, the heat is dissipated, not increased. Well, is there evidence of thermite? And what is thermite anyway?
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
Well, maybe we're getting somewhere here, because if thermite were used, thermate, it would explain the presence of the sulfur, because sulfur is added to thermite, which makes it thermate, essentially. It would also explain the incredible heat, because thermite or thermate release incredible quantities of heat, 4,000 degrees, as you saw. And it would also explain the presence of elemental iron, which is released here, which you'll see a lot of evidence for in a moment. So thermate explains the evidence that the official story can't explain any of the evidence that we just looked at, or the evidence that we looked at last week. NFPA 921 again says, hey, look for unusual residues that could arise from thermite or other pyrotechnic materials. Well, NIST says they found no corroborating evidence to suggest that explosives were used. Well, interesting. A year later, when pressed, they finally admit NIST did not test for the presence of explosive residue. You can't find what you will not look for. But others did. It wasn't hard to find, actually. Stephen Jones is one of them. He's a nuclear scientist, physicist, formerly with Brigham Young University. He says, well, gosh, thermite reactions would produce a characteristic burn pattern, a white, yellow, hot liquid metal, like we see pouring out of the South Tower minutes prior to its collapse. Would also produce a whitish cloud of aluminum oxide ash, like we see rising from this material pouring out of the South Tower minutes prior to its collapse, like we see trailing these individually freely flying structural steel sections. Again, we looked at the trajectory of these last week. Gravity works down. This is out. Check out part 2 of this series on YouTube. But steel is not flammable under normal conditions. So how is the steel on fire under office fire conditions? It's not the jet fuel. Jet fuel is only 600 degrees in open air. What caused all of these steel pieces freely flying, trailed by thick white smoke clouds? It looks more like the volcanic eruption in the Tongan Sea in 2009. Upward, outward, arching streamers. A geometry of fireworks. Freely flying solid objects in all directions. This is not a collapse. It's an incredible series of explosions, which we looked at in detail last week. These are identical buildings, and the collapses are identical. In both cases, we have thick white smoke clouds ejected. In both cases, we have steel beams on fire.
Where the grapplers were pulling stuff out, big sections of iron that were literally on fire on the other end. They would hit the air and burst into flame.
Do we have the signature of thermite? Dr. Jones says it would leave behind a unique chemical evidence. Common elements such as iron, aluminum, copper, calcium, silicon, but more unusual elements such as fluorine and manganese left behind in the residue. These elements in the periodic table of the elements. So somebody, a sculptor who had access to this 40-pound chunk of meteorite, they called them, these huge chunks of fused molten metal. A small chip was sent to Stephen Jones. He performs electron microprobe data on this one. He finds out it's predominantly iron. So we can rule out molten aluminum from the jet planes. It has abundant manganese, so you can rule out molten structural steel. It's not molten structural steel. It's liquid molten iron that was molten. And so it has the residue of thermite because it has aluminum, sulfur, and potassium also. This should not be found in the World Trade Center dust. Furthermore, though, it has manganese and fluorine in abundance. What? Where does that come from? Manganese is from the potassium permanganate, commonly used as an oxidizer in thermite. Fluorine is used in sol-gel type thermite charges. So potassium, manganese, and fluorine are often present in the World Trade Center. So this is clearly a part of thermite fingerprint. But what also would be present if sol-gels were used, very advanced form of thermite? 1,3-diphenyl propane. Well, the EPA analyzes the dust. They said one molecule was present at levels that dwarfed all others. 1,3-diphenyl propane. We've never observed it in any other sampling that we've ever done, says Eric Schwartz of the EPA. So what else can it be? Dr. Jones has sent another piece of slag from the International Peace Park in Manitoba. He does X-ray fluorescence analysis on this one. He finds iron, sulfur, potassium, manganese. Again, the ingredients of ignited thermite. As you see here, with some aluminum, which would indicate some partially ignited thermite, and iron, manganese, potassium, carbon, silica. We'll get to the carbon and silica in a moment. You can make in your own backyard, as John Cole, civil engineer, did, your own shaped cutter charges. It's not that hard to do. Forcing the molten iron through
was reduced
the
in
structural
thickness with
components.
gaping holes, thin to almost razor sharpness, with a Swiss cheese appearance.
Interesting. Where did we see that before? Oh yeah, in the Appendix C, metallurgical examination of the FEMA report in May of 2002. The same results from the same type of material. But there are much more efficient patented devices, patented prior to 9/11, which issue projected particle streams of molten iron in hundreds of milliseconds. Much more effective at cutting through greater thicknesses of steel than even C4 or RDX, high energy explosives. Why would they have wanted to avoid or not use high energy explosives? Well, those provide very loud bangs and very bright flashes, which they most assuredly would want to avoid in a deceptive controlled demolition like these. There are devices whose casings themselves are made out of consolidated consumable thermite. Nothing left behind but pools of molten iron, which are documented, as we saw. But regarding the most interesting part of all of this, the molten iron spheres found in all the World Trade Center powder samples by the U.S. Geological Survey in 2005. Their particle atlas of the World Trade Center dust. What do they find? Billions of previously molten iron microspheres, elemental iron, amounting to up to 4 tons of this by extrapolation. They have no idea where they came from, but they know it's not iron particles found in common office building dust, because there's 150 times at least the amount of them in the World Trade Center dust. And office dust is not spherical like these molten iron. Office dust iron particles are not spherical. So the R.J. Lee Group, who does analysis also on the dust, an environmental consulting firm, says these are formed during the event, not before by the iron workers, the welders putting together the buildings, or not after by the iron workers taking them apart, but during the event itself. So they're so abundant and characteristic of all the dust that they're used to form a signature component. In other words, it's not even World Trade Center dust unless it has these previously molten iron microspheres, some of which are 1/16 of an inch large, some of which are almost naked to the human eye. How do you create them? Well, here's a small thermite experiment producing thousands of degrees, first of all, and sparks, but they're not sparks. They're molten iron, because the ingredients of thermite is iron oxide, which is essentially rust, and aluminum. Well, the aluminum turns into the gas, which you saw here. Not a gas, but an aluminum ash releasing there. And how do we get spherical shapes? Well, aerosolized liquids form themselves into spheres by surface tension. That's just what it does. Spray a spray bottle, there are spheres. So they cool and they fall with all of the dust on things like these cars, and they can toast the tops of these cars. What other rational explanation is there for the toasting of the tops of these cars parked around the World Trade Center? But that's not all. What else was found in this World Trade Center dust? Well, a team of international scientists led by Niels Harrit from Copenhagen received 7 independently collected samples. And like the one from Jeanette McKinley's apartment here, right across the street from the towers, her windows blew in. All these apartments were filled with this dust, and she lost her life because she was handling it for years. As an artist, she was using it for therapy for her trauma, which she sustained that day. Most tragically, she died of brain cancer, probably as a result of handling that dust. What was in it? They found red-gray chips, red on one side, gray on the other, about 1/16 of an inch long. They're in all the samples. It's not paint, as you'll see. They thought it was, but it's attracted by a magnet, so it has a very high iron content. They do. How would they have applied a dual layered red-gray chip? Well, it would be liquid applied. Well, could that have been done under the auspices of a fireproofing upgrade, which happened in the year prior to 9/11? We'll just leave that open for now because I haven't worked out the details of these fireproofing upgrades, but it is very interesting that these upgrades were located on the floors immediately above and below the point of jet plane impacts on each tower, which were different in each tower. 15 stories down in the case of the North Tower, 30 stories down in the case of the South Tower. So it's a very interesting correlation. We'll come back to that later. But these red-gray chips were analyzed with X-ray energy dispersive spectroscopy. And what do they find in these chips? They find, once again, iron and aluminum, the ingredients of thermite. This is not paint. Very, very interesting. So they zoom in 50,000 times to the red layer on top. And what do they find? Nano-sized particles of iron oxide and aluminum powder. Iron oxide crystals and aluminum platelets. 1,000 times smaller than the diameter of a human hair. This is extremely sophisticated material. It's set in a matrix of organic material, oxygen, silica, carbon. This is the material that's used in TNT to expand rapidly, to knock things over as high energy explosives do. So it's fascinating that we have an incendiary that seems to be mixed with explosive material or explosive organic material, which is used in explosives, to become more explosive, presumably. So we follow the peer-reviewed literature here, and we find what? That this is called super thermite, and at about, turns out to be 758 degrees Fahrenheit, we have an ignition of this material, which is also reproducible in the actual 4 samples that they had time to study here. And what happens when there is an ignition? It gets extremely hot, releases a whole lot of energy, and what else? Iron microspheres with the same chemical signature as the iron microspheres found and documented by the USGS in the World Trade Center dust. So you see, we know where those iron microspheres came from. They came from these red-gray chips. As if we didn't know, they're found attached to partially ignited red-gray chips, as you see here and here. So you see, this is an internally consistent, self-corroborating set of repeatable experimental data that could be used in a court of law, for instance, to bring the real perpetrators of 9/11 to justice. And we have submitted this in courts of law, as we'll show you. You see, when you get these particles so small, their surface volume increases exponentially. So you've engineered something that's an incendiary to become more explosive. How explosive? We don't know. But it shouldn't be found in the World Trade Center dust. This is made only in the most advanced defense contracting laboratories. So we know where to look. Those who are enterprising journalists who want to get to the truth of what really happened there, find out who makes this stuff. Find out how it got in the World Trade Center dust. The Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal cites that this is active, unreacted thermitic material. This is a 25-page peer-reviewed paper that has not been contested. The way to contest somebody's conspiracy theory is to put up your own peer-reviewed paper challenging the science. This has not been done. So what we've been looking at today is direct evidence of destruction with incendiaries today, explosives yesterday. Fire doesn't create any one of these characteristics either, let alone all of them, but not especially these fires, which by the thermal imaging videos with the FLIR from the NASA flights shows that these fires are only about 200 degrees Fahrenheit. And this has no evidence that they're more than 600 degrees Fahrenheit, but they claim 1800 degrees Fahrenheit. So what do the experts say? Those experts, at least without financial or political obligations that might sway their objective opinion. Like 100 structural engineers signed on to the petition at AE 9/11 Truth, one of which is Ronald Brookman. It doesn't look anything like a heat-induced gravitational collapse mechanism. Why did the complete collapse of the Twin Towers become inevitable, as NIST claimed? Why would all 110 stories drop straight down to the ground in 10 seconds, pulverizing the contents to dust and twisted steel? Fire protection engineer Ed Munyak. Fires were very weak. The NIST reports confirm that the steel temperatures were low. The collapses have no resemblance to any previous high-rise fire collapse, because high-rises, steel frame fireproof structures have not come down due to fire. What about the evidence? Surely it was preserved. I mean, this is a crime scene. Well, let's go to structural engineer Abolhassan Astani Azal from Berkeley, who supports the official story.
After 9/11, we realized that Port Authority of New York and New Jersey has sent all the steel that we need to study. That's why I'm here to study steel. Has sent all the steel to recycling plant to go to China for recycling. For what? For 15 cents a pound. Just nothing. And all the evidence of steel went to melting pot.
The evidence of the steel went to the melting pot to China for recycling. Well, what does Mayor Bloomberg have to say about that? Just looking at a piece of metal generally doesn't tell you anything. In an effort to justify the shipment of steel to China for recycling, prompting Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, to cry out, "Crucial evidence that could answer many questions is on the slow boat to China, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately." But it didn't. In easily the largest and most perplexing structural failures in history, we have 400 truckloads a day, starting just 2 weeks after 9/11, carted and put on barges, shipped to China. This is the illegal destruction of evidence in a crime scene. But they got away with it. How? They declared it an act of war because the Pentagon was attacked. So they're not bound by the regulations about preservation of evidence in a crime scene. So what brought the towers down? Using the scientific method, what did we find today and last week regarding the Twin Towers? Did the planes bring it down? Did those small fires bring it down? Or was it explosions and even controlled demolition with incendiaries, as we looked at today? That's what we leave you with. We've looked at features 8, 9, and 10, very uncharacteristic features of controlled demolition. Features, nevertheless, with additional, and last week we looked at features 1 through 7. Again, part 2 of this series. Encourage you to search for that on YouTube. This is all direct evidence of destruction with explosives. Fire doesn't create these features, any of them, let alone all of them, with additional circumstantial corroborative testimony and eyewitness evidence that we've looked at last week and this week. This is proof of controlled demolition, a proof that has convinced 3,400 architects and engineers to sign on to the petition demanding a new investigation into the destruction of all 3 World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. If you want to join them, I encourage you, but maybe you have some questions about today's presentation. I encourage you to ask, and Andy will let us know how you can do just that.
All right, thank you, Richard. Please submit any questions that you might have in the input form that we talked about before. That's at ae911truth.org. Just look for continuing education and select the live webinars. You'll see a box right there, and we will do our best to answer them. But in the meantime, we're going to tell you about some of the ways that you can get involved if, now that you're informed, you agree this evidence is compelling and warrants a new investigation.
Yep. Thank you, Andy. While you're there, by the way, subscribe to our email newsletter. You can get the latest evidence that we're assembling, the latest efforts we're making toward getting a real investigation. We'll keep in touch. We have 70,000 subscribers, and we want you to be among them. So sign up right here at ae911truth.org. It takes 2 minutes. And get informed there. We have an incredible body of evidence that we want you to be looking at and getting familiar with so that you can become dangerous like we are out there. But we need a lot more of us, which is you, spreading the information, the science about the real cause of the collapse of these towers. Sign the petition too, especially if you're an architect or engineer. But even if you're not, we have 29,000 members of the public supporting the engineers as well. And donate. We're a group of 6 employees of this nonprofit organization that are working full-time to get you a real investigation of what happened. We've got to make greater efforts that we're going to be telling you about here, but you can support us. That's really important. Right here on our website, you can become a member for as little as a cup of coffee a month. you can join the family of sustaining supporters at AE 911 Truth. And hey, if you can't do that, I think there are some ways you can volunteer. Is that right, Andy?
Absolutely. There's always ways that you can volunteer, and there's always things that need to be done here at AE 911 Truth. You can volunteer by filling out the volunteer form on the page, and we can give you an assignment. You can also volunteer by contacting your representatives, which we'll talk about in a few minutes here, but that's considered volunteering too. But the first step is deciding that you are going to do it. I say it every week because that is so true. Inertia is a major force out there. If you're at rest and doing nothing, it's hard to get out of that mental state, but once you do, you can't stop. So please decide that you're going to be part of history, and I think our time is coming now. You can see it happening around the world, changes in attitudes and changes in minds, but we still got to do that work of getting this information before the public and, of course, before professionals and politicians and all the people that need to hear this so that we can have victory in the end, the final justice. So please go to the ae911truth.org, read about it, and consider doing that work. Volunteer.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. And you can work on your own too. Hey, you can contact your representatives, the television, radio, newspaper. Send the ae911truth.org link to every architect and engineer that you can find, everyone else that you know. Screen the DVDs. I'll show you an example of our landmark documentary here, and share them and the brochures one-on-one with people. The brochures are $10 for 100 of them. You can get them out real easily and to everybody. And you can download the 135-page structural finite element analysis that was performed by Professor Leroy Halsey, and give that to structural engineers in your community, and send it to anyone with a technical background. Really important because, excuse me, we had a 4-year, $300,000 study, which completely pulled the rug out from underneath the NIST report. They found that the fire didn't cause the collapse of Building 7. They found that it didn't even experience a progressive collapse as claimed by NIST. It was actually a global collapse caused by the near simultaneous failure of all of its columns. And that's all documented in the new movie 7, which you can watch on Amazon. And that's why we sent 75,000 cards to engineers. I'm trying to get one to every engineer in the country, but we still need your support. And we need your support with the inquest, which is being submitted in 2 weeks to the Attorney General of the United Kingdom, because Jeff Campbell was murdered and his family wants justice. And the real murderers exposed of his, he was on the 106th floor of the North Tower. His body was blown into many, many, many pieces. It was extremely unfortunate and direct evidence of the explosions that we've been talking about, particularly last week. And that's why we have a unanimous decision on the part of these fire commissioners to call for a resolution for a new investigation. That's why we have an appeal to NIST, for which we are suing them now that we have been, our appeal has been denied. We're going through all the legal channels. So this is a very, very important legal effort among many that we're pursuing. And we need your help. How are we going to do that, Andy?
All right. Like I said before, first step is you got to decide you're going to do it. And this is a great way to get started. I did it several times over the past couple of years, is contact your member of Congress. Now, the one good thing about the situation right now between the citizens of this country and their government is that they seem to not have to require you to go into their offices anymore to have meetings. So that opens us up and lets us be able to talk to them over the phone. But the thing is, because we're in different districts, we've only got one congressman, each of us, if it's a congressman that is outside of our district, or a congresswoman, I should add, they need to hear from a constituent first. So that's where you come in. And you can go to their website, you can select a meeting request and let them know that you want to talk to them about the request for correction that's going on, and also the lawsuit now against NIST, as we talked about on my show last week, and also the Bobby McIlvaine World Trade Center Investigation Act. This is draft legislation for a new investigation, which the 9/11 Truth Movement has been asking about for years. And it would create a select committee that would look into this evidence that Richard is talking about. And it's written in such a way that they have to actually look at this evidence. They can't just dismiss it and put another rubber stamp on the official story. And of course, it's named after Bobby McIlvaine, who was killed as he was entering the North Tower on that morning. So again, this is waiting for you. It's been waiting for a couple of years, waiting for a brave member of Congress to step forward and introduce it, and several other brave members of Congress to vote for it. But they got to have that political pressure, because nothing happens in this country politically unless they hear from the constituents. So please consider getting involved. And if you have any questions about it, you can write to us at congress@ae911truth.org.
Thank you, Andy. And we will do the presentation for you. You don't even have to do anything other than set it up and let us know when it is. We'll be there for you. The grand jury investigation continues with a couple of last strands of hope. And tomorrow we will be announcing a appeal to the Supreme Court of the United States in the case of the AE 9/11 Truth versus the FBI. The FBI had our evidence in the form of documentary, in the form of the 25-page peer-reviewed paper about the active thermitic materials. They were compelled by Congress to give Congress the evidence that they had accumulated since the 9/11 Commission report. And they didn't. So we sued them. And this has now arrived at the highest level of appeal. So join us in that effort. You'll be hearing more about it. And the evidence that they had is nowhere more carefully put together and easily watchable than in our documentary 9/11 Explosive Evidence Experts Speak Out, and where we've assembled 40 high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolition experts, all laying out the evidence here. Take a look, a couple minutes. This will blow your mind. So you want to make sure you see this, and I'm going to show you how to see it coming up.
I don't want to be involved in conspiracy theories. There are lots of them. They can go on. We can speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the documents from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved.
In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red-grade crystals are very high-temperature incendiaries.
And we have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined and scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. When the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
And yes, you can look at this free on YouTube also. The 1 hour version. There's a 90-minute version, which I highly recommend. It's available on our website, the DVD. And you also get with that the extended interviews of 40 of these experts. So a double DVD. So take advantage of that. Also, take advantage of the free download of the PDF of our very carefully put together magazine called Beyond Misinformation, which is a complete pulling of the rug out from underneath the NIST report. There's a coffee table version of it, very classy. I highly recommend you get that for the VIPs that you might know who like to read and see the evidence, or you might want to have it on your coffee table. And it's a great read. It's not overly technical at all. The classic lecture on this series, 9/11 Blueprint for Truth, available free on YouTube, as is the 15-minute documentary about World Trade Center 7, narrated by actor Ed Asner. Highly recommended to start people off. That's where you start them. That's AE 9/11 Truth 101, Building 7. Hey, I think we might have some questions. Is that true, Andy?
We got several questions today, so let's get started on them. First one asks, great job on the presentations and the website and resources. Is there any initiatives to create local study groups by local constituencies or government districts? We need to organize applied scientists and technicians to look at this past failure, but also to be prepared to challenge future errors and omissions using the First Amendment is very important. Thanks. And I'll go ahead and answer first because I take care of a lot of the volunteer work here and with strategy and whatnot. Well, we already do have a local study thing. It's well, it's not local, but it's right here on the webinars every week. This is probably the best source that you can get on this information. And one of the problems, though, when you put it out or you branch it out, then there's people that try to come in with disinformation, and suddenly the group turns into a discussion about the New World Order or something. And you know, we want to keep it on focus. So I'd say if you want to study, just watch these webinars every week. And the first time I ever had to do an interview for AE, I studied like crazy, like it was for the Regencies in New York. So absolutely, if somebody wants to go down and talk to their member of Congress and they want a group to go with them, and if this person is sane and not disturbed and whatnot, because we do protect your information. Unfortunately, there's people that try to get the hold of it who aren't necessarily working for the best interests of AE. But if we determine that the person should have a group with them, we will do it. I did it years ago with Edward Hanna. So that's something we would consider, and using the First Amendment is very important.
Thank you, Andy. You got another question?
Yeah, the next one says, I believe that there was evidence of molten steel and that during the cleanup there would have been many eyewitnesses of the molten steel. Where are these cleanup workers today?
Well, that's a great question. We quote them, and we consider that sufficient. I haven't followed their whereabouts. I think the evidence that we've assembled here is makes our presentation long enough. In altogether about 5 hours. And do you have any other thoughts on that one?
That is a good question. I mean, it's hard to find people who were there at the scene. Some of them are documented with their names right next to their quotes, and certainly we should follow up with them. I agree with that. I would like to talk to people who maybe doesn't necessarily get into some of the news reports and whatnot about what they saw. Some people see something and they just kind of clam up and go quiet. So yeah, there should be more talk to the witnesses, or speaking with the witnesses who were there that day, definitely. The next question says, how can the USGS notice all the iron microspheres without seeing any of the red-gray chips?
Oh, that's a good question. That's actually fascinating and caught me by surprise. The USGS, the U.S. Geological Survey, documented, and RJ Lee Group and others have documented these molten iron microspheres, which are throughout the World Trade Center dust, up to 4 tons. Shouldn't be there. It's molten iron. Where does molten iron 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit to create? Well, these chips, they probably thought they were paint chips. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff in that dust. So they may not have done a detailed study because they just wrote them off as being paint chips. I'm assuming the best motive for these agencies. But the spheres, they couldn't classify, in their minds as to being anything close to natural. So they went into a great deal of detail, fortunately, to document them. So very interestingly, we have no analysis on the part of these guys of these red-gray chips that are full of iron oxide and aluminum powder, the ingredients of thermite. Yeah, and that produce the spheres. That answers the questions as to how the spheres were produced. So I can only assume, well, I can assume 2 things. 1, ignorance. 2, cover up. I won't speculate as to which one it was. How about you, Andy?
Well, my default position is that every group that has gotten the dust sample should be doing the same test as Stephen Jones and Niels Harrit did. So I would just assume that they did not have this in their paradigm, the idea that there could have been more to this event than what they knew, and they didn't bother to look for it. And they may not want to for obvious reasons. Next question says, what can be said about the people who seem to be standing in the airplane-shaped hole in one of the towers before its collapse?
Well, the fires only can last 20 or 30 minutes in a given location, as fire protection engineers and even NIST acknowledge. So if the fire started in the area where the plane left a hole in the building, then it would have moved on, in the course of an hour. So, and it did. There's fires in other. The fire moved on, and there's evidence of it in other places. So I don't know what else I might say about that.
All right. Let's see. Next question. What are the probabilities of one building collapsing at free fall speed? What about all 3 on the same day?
Well, if there's a controlled demolition, the probabilities are great that it could collapse at free fall speed, because all of the columns in the building have been removed by explosives all at once. And that's darn near what we have at Building 7. Well, we do have free fall for a third of that building's 7-second fall. So the probability of that happening by the few small scattered fires in that building are 0. So, I mean, there's no probability. The probability,
I was going to say FEMA said Building 7 was a low probability event, low probability of occurrence there. However, there's supposedly an engineer on the scene telling the fire chief that this is going to come down in 5 hours, and 5 hours later it happens. So how do you predict that a low probability event is going to actually occur? And BBC was right on the nose too, 20 minutes earlier. So
yeah, we've never lost a steel frame skyscraper to fire before. And this engineer, who remains anonymous, analyzing Building 7 on the spot, says, oh, it has about 5 hours. And we saw this in part 1 of this series, by the way. You can look that up on YouTube free. And so guess what? 5 hours later, it came down. That is foreknowledge. Only one example of lots of foreknowledge. Andy mentioned another, the BBC announcing the collapse 20 minutes before it happened. That's foreknowledge. That is damning to the official story, as all the other evidence we've provided is.
Exactly. If there's any kind of statistics expert out there, or probability expert who wants to calculate that probability on September 11th, I'd be interested in hearing that number. Last question, good one. Is it difficult to hear people discussing the apparent troop withdrawal from Afghanistan without wanting to mention the evidence of 9/11 deception?
Well, the 9/11 deception is the reason that was given to us for invading Afghanistan on the auspices of finding Osama bin Laden, and invading Iraq as well under the auspices that Saddam Hussein had ties to Osama bin Laden. I would think that people would begin thinking as these troop withdrawals occur, if they do. I tend to doubt that they will actually, but that's just my own speculation. That people would think, well, why were we there in the first place? Well, they go right back to 9/11, the attack on the Twin Towers, the act of war, which is declared because of the attack on the Pentagon. So hopefully there'll be a whole lot more scrutiny on this question. What do you think, Andy?
Absolutely. Actually, it's difficult for me to hear people discussing pretty much anything without telling them about September 11th, because so much of our current world is based on what happened on that day. So anytime that you can work it in, you want to keep your head and be calm about it, but you want to be able to slide it in there and use every opportunity as a chance to educate people. So please do.
Yeah, because it's the domino. 9/11 is the most obvious way of bringing people to awareness that things aren't right in this country. And it just turned my world upside down. I mean, I was a flag waving Reagan Republican that I wanted to go and get those bastards who did this to us. I mean, can you imagine how embarrassed I am about holding those beliefs and that mindset before becoming aware of the truth about what really happened at the World Trade Center? So we want to wake people up. This is not about buildings, okay? Yes, we lost some great buildings. Well, some people thought they were great, others didn't. But 3,000 people were murdered. 8,000 now U.S. soldiers, I think, have been killed in Afghanistan and Iraq, not to mention the 2 million Afghanis and Iraqis that have been murdered, all on the auspices of the attack in New York and DC. And this is, well, I guess the Pentagon's not in DC, is it? It's in Virginia. Is that true, Andy? I've been there, but I forgot what state it's actually in. Anyway,
I believe it is. Yeah, go ahead.
It's the area. So if we can show, and starting with Building 7, if we can show that Building 7 was clearly a controlled demolition, it calls into question and opens people's mind about what really happened with the Twin Towers. And we show them this evidence, and it's so clear, as you've seen today. All of a sudden, you've got a tool that'll wake people up not only to the false flag operation of 9/11, but all the false flag operations that we have been deceived with. And there's no end to them. So we've been looking at part 3 today. Guess what? We looked at part 2 last week, and we're going to start again in August. The first Thursday of August, 1:00 p.m. Pacific. Join us right here, and we'll bring it to you. We're not going to stop. We hope you won't either. Until next time, thanks, Andy, and thanks, everybody, for joining us. Bye for now.